They said she was reckless, too young to carry the weight of combat on her shoulders. A girl who barely filled out the fatigues of those who had gone before her. And when she was disarmed that day, stripped of her M9 pistol in front of everyone, laughter rippled through the room like the punchline to a cruel joke. But 30 seconds later, silence would replace every smirk, and respect would hang in the air heavier than any weapon ever could. If you believe respect should be earned by courage, not by stereotypes, then like and subscribe. Because this story is about the moment a young veteran proved that sometimes the strongest person in the room is the one you least expect. It began on a crisp autumn morning at Fort Alden, the kind where the sky looked cut from steel and the wind seemed to sharpen every word spoken, every gesture made. Second Lieutenant Maren Cole, barely 27, walked across the training yard with her cap tucked low and her steps deliberate, but the whispers followed her anyway. "Pretty face, wrong place," someone muttered, not softly enough. Another cadet, emboldened, joked about how the only thing she could disarm was a cafeteria tray. She heard it all, but if it stung, she never let it show. Her hands stayed steady, her jaw set, and her eyes never wavered from the task ahead. The day's drill was supposed to be routine. Close-quarters combat training with live role-play aggressors, a test of reflexes, coordination, and discipline. But from the moment she lined up with her squad, it was clear that this wasn't just an exercise. It was a test of her worth, whether anyone would admit it aloud or not. The sergeant leading the drill, a broad-shouldered man named Vance, eyed her with a look that hovered somewhere between amusement and doubt. "Cole," he said, holding out his hand, palm up, hand it over. She froze only long enough to let the meaning settle before unclipping her holster and placing her M9 pistol into his waiting grip. "You won't be needing this," he added, loud enough for the whole squad to hear. "Not today." A few chuckles broke out, low but sharp. Someone muttered, "Now she's really harmless." The pistol clicked into the sergeant's belt, and in that small sound Maren could feel a curtain being drawn. Her weapon, her shield, gone, her credibility with it. But if they expected her to flinch, to protest, they were disappointed. She only nodded once, as though acknowledging the rules of a game they hadn't realized she'd already mastered. At the edge of the field, Specialist Grant, the youngest in the squad, glanced at her curiously. He had seen something the others hadn't, a flicker in her posture, the way her shoulders relaxed instead of tightened, the way her breathing slowed, measured, like a diver filling her lungs before plunging into deep water. He didn't say anything then, but later he would recall that moment like the inhale before a storm. The drill began with the sound of boots thundering across the gravel, hostiles pouring into the mock compound, rifles raised, voices shouting commands that blurred together into a wall of chaos. Maren moved with her squad, unarmed, shadowed by the judgment of those who thought she would falter. She felt their eyes more than she heard their orders, waiting for her to stumble, to confirm their assumptions. But instead of rushing, she observed the terrain, the angles, the way her squad mates' weapons tracked sloppily, betraying nerves they thought they had buried under bravado. And then, in an instant, the test became real. Two role players broke formation, advancing faster than scripted, cutting off the path forward with weapons leveled too close for comfort. The squad hesitated, rifles jerking between targets, shouts overlapping, panic threading through their precision. Maren, standing empty-handed in the middle of the chaos, tilted her head slightly, as though listening to something only she could hear. Later, Specialist Grant would swear it was the exact same calm he had seen on the faces of combat medics in Afghanistan, the kind of stillness you only learn when you've already lived through fire. To the others, it looked like resignation. What could she do, unarmed, boxed in? They would soon find out. But for now, in those early moments, she carried the silence like a weapon sharper than steel, each step deliberate, each breath controlled. And though the sergeant's smirk lingered at the edge of her vision, she let it pass over her without acknowledgement. For her, this wasn't about proving anyone wrong. It was about proving to herself that you don't need the weight of a pistol on your hip to know who you are when everything turns dangerous. And in 30 seconds, she would show them all. The first shove came from the left, hard enough to stagger one of her squad mates into the wall of the mock compound, his rifle clattering against the cement barrier as the role player pressed in with a training blade. Shouts erupted, Boots scraped across the gravel, and suddenly the controlled exercise fractured into raw panic. But Marin Cole did not move the way the others did. She didn't jerk, didn't panic, didn't look for permission. She stepped forward with a calm that felt out of place. In the storm, the first hostile reached for her, overconfident in her lack of a weapon, and that was the mistake. She pivoted on the ball of her foot, redirecting his arm, and in a blur of movement that most barely caught, his own training blade was ripped from his grip and pressed harmlessly against his chest, signaling a kill. Before he could even react to being outmaneuvered, she spun the blade into her palm and dropped him to the ground, already shifting her focus. "Contact left," someone shouted desperately, but Marin was already there, intercepting the second aggressor before the squad's rifles could stabilize. He raised his mock rifle to butt her aside, but she closed the distance with precision, snapping her elbow into the joint of his arm, forcing the barrel offline, twisting the weapon out of his grip, and using his own momentum to pin him to the ground. By now, the laughter had evaporated. The squad was stunned into silence even as the chaos raged. She moved without hesitation, no wasted effort, no noise, only decisive strikes. A boot that swept a third hostile's leg out from under him, a controlled disarm that left his training pistol spinning harmlessly into the dirt, a chokehold broken just before it cut off breath, but enough to signal dominance. Each movement flowed into the next like she had rehearsed this her entire life, and maybe she had. Not in drills, not in classrooms, but in the weight of the years she had spent studying close-quarters combat, honing skills others dismissed as extra, skills that in this moment turned her into something untouchable. The sergeant shouted orders from the sideline, but his voice had lost its edge, cracking with disbelief as he realized what was happening. One by one, the so-called hostiles went down, their weapons clattering uselessly against the dirt and concrete, their mock aggression reduced to nothing under the efficiency of her hands. Time seemed to compress. 30 seconds stretched long enough for every bystander to register what they were witnessing, yet short enough that by the time they processed it, it was over. Her squad stood frozen, rifles raised but never fired, their mouths open, eyes wide, watching as she subdued the last aggressor by flipping his rifle against the wall, kicking it free, and pressing her palm flat against his chest in a mock signal that ended the fight. The yard fell silent. Her chest rose and fell with steady breaths. Her hair clung to her temples with sweat, but her eyes were as calm as they had been at the start. The silence that followed wasn't just the quiet of a drill concluded. It was the silence of realization, of something undeniable. She had been disarmed, humiliated, stripped of the symbol of power they all thought defined her. And yet she had turned that into an advantage, proving that skill, discipline, and courage could eclipse any weapon. The role players, now catching their breath on the ground, looked up at her with something far different than mockery. The squad shifted awkwardly, lowering their rifles, no longer seeing her as the easy target, the weak link. Even Specialist Grant, who had sensed something different in her from the start, stood straighter now, pride flickering in his eyes. 30 seconds, that was all it had taken. 30 seconds to shatter every assumption in that yard. Marin Cole didn't celebrate, didn't gloat. She simply handed the training blade to the nearest instructor, stepped back into formation, and stood silently, waiting for the next command. And in that silence, the entire squad finally understood. They had seen power not in the weapon she carried, but in the way she carried herself when it was gone. For a long moment no one moved, the dust from the scuffle still hanging in the cold morning air, boots frozen mid-step, rifles half raised. The role players sprawled on the gravel blinking up at the sky, as though they too couldn't believe how fast it had all ended. And at the center of it all stood Marin Cole, unarmed, unshaken, her chest rising in slow measured breaths, her hands loose at her sides as if she had merely stretched rather than dismantled 6 armed opponents in less than 30 seconds. And that silence weighed more than any after-action report ever could. It was the silence of realization, of shame, of respect forced into existence. Sergeant Vance was the first to break, his voice cracking louder than intended as he barked, "Reset the drill." But the words carried no authority, just desperation, as if saying them would undo what everyone had just witnessed. Nobody moved. The squad still stared at her, rifles slack at their sides. And even the role players, supposed to pop back up and reset, stayed down for a beat longer, exchanging glances that admitted something rare. They had been beaten fairly and completely, not by brute force, but by something they hadn't trained for: composure. Vance's face flushed red, a mixture of anger and embarrassment, and he marched toward her with the pistol still tucked in his belt. "You think this proves something?" he snapped, but his voice lacked the confidence it had earlier when he had mocked her. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The silence was her reply, steady and unyielding, and that silence made him falter more than any words would have. Behind him, a door slammed, and the sound of deliberate footsteps cut across the stunned yard. Heads turned. A black sedan had pulled up quietly during the exercise, and now striding toward them was a figure that made even the loudest mouths close instantly. Colonel Isaac Langford, base commander, ribbons gleaming on his chest, expression carved in stone. He didn't speak as he approached. He didn't need to. He scanned the yard, the subdued squad, the embarrassed sergeant, and finally his gaze locked on Marin. "Who disarmed her?" he asked, his voice quiet but carrying like thunder. Vance stiffened. I did, sir." "It was part of what?" Langford cut in, eyes narrowing. "Part of humiliating your own officer in front of her squad? Part of ignoring her service record because you fought a weapon to find her?" His words hit like blows, and the squad shifted uncomfortably under the weight of truth. Vance swallowed hard, but the colonel had already turned away, stepping closer to Marin. For the first time, the squad saw something in her they hadn't before: the colonel's respect. "Lieutenant Cole," he said firmly, "I reviewed your file last week. Close quarters combat instructor, advanced certification in Krav Maga, distinguished service in Operation Viper Nest, 2 commendations for saving fellow soldiers in hand-to-hand engagements when ammunition had run dry. And yet here," he gestured to the squad, "you're treated as if you're decoration. Tell me, what did you just demonstrate?" Marin's eyes met his without wavering. "That a weapon is a tool, sir," she said quietly, "not an identity." The words lingered in the air, sinking into every ear that had once laughed at her, every mind that had measured her worth by the pistol on her hip. The colonel nodded slowly, then turned to the rest of the squad. "You all witnessed 30 seconds of what leadership really looks like. Calm under pressure, skill under scrutiny, courage without noise. If any of you believe you'll carry respect into battle with just a weapon in hand, you're already dead. Respect is carried here." He tapped his chest. "And here." He tapped his temple. The silence deepened. No one dared smirk. No one dared scoff, because they knew he was right. Sergeant Vance's face burned as he tried to salvage dignity, but even his own squad wouldn't meet his eyes. Slowly, one by one, the soldiers turned toward Marin, and it began subtly. A rifle lowered in acknowledgement, a chin dipped, a hand raised in salute, not because they had been told to, but because they knew it was owed. And then, in unison, the entire squad snapped to attention, boots thundering as they saluted their lieutenant for the very first time without hesitation. Marin did not gloat, did not smile. She simply returned the salute with quiet precision, then stepped back into formation as though nothing had changed, but everything had. Word of the drill spread faster than official reports could contain it. By evening, the barracks were alive with retellings, each soldier exaggerating the details, but never able to capture the stillness in her eyes, the composure that had broken them more thoroughly than any strike. Cadets whispered about it in the mess hall. Instructors dissected it in classrooms. Even the role players, bruised but humbled, admitted privately they'd never been dismantled that efficiently. And by the week's end, the story had already become a lesson. Remember Lieutenant Cole. She didn't need a pistol. The colonel, however, refused to let it remain just a story. At the next assembly, with the entire base gathered, he recounted what had happened, stripping away rumor and exaggeration until only the truth remained. He called her to the front, the same young woman who had walked into that drill mocked and underestimated, and introduced her not as the officer they thought they knew, but as the warrior who had once saved a squad from insurgents when their rifles jammed and the fight came down to hands and will. 30 seconds, Langford said to the assembly, his voice echoing off steel beams. That's how long it took her to show that discipline and training will outlast arrogance every time. 30 seconds to turn humiliation into command. 30 seconds to prove that the person you dismiss today may be the one who saves you tomorrow. The hall was silent, not out of duty, but reverence. And when Marin stepped back into the ranks, her fellow soldiers straightened just a little taller, as if to carry some of the weight she had borne alone until now. Months later, when new recruits arrived at Fort Alden, they were taken to the training yard where the incident had occurred. The instructors told them about the day Lieutenant Cole was disarmed, mocked, laughed at, and then about the 30 seconds that followed. It wasn't presented as legend or myth. It was presented as doctrine, a reminder that strength isn't always loud, that leadership isn't about the weapon you're issued, but the calm you carry when the world unravels. A plaque was eventually mounted on the wall of the compound. 30 seconds. Lieutenant Marin Cole. Respect is not earned, it is earned. She never asked for it, never wanted it, but she never argued against it either, because she knew that it wasn't about her anymore. It was about every recruit who would stand there in years to come, hearing the story and realizing that dignity, composure, and courage are worth more than the steel in your hand. And in quiet moments, when she walked past the plaque on her way back from drills, she would sometimes pause, not to bask in pride, but to remember those 30 seconds when the laughter died, when silence proved louder than any gunshot, when she had shown that even disarmed, she was never powerless. And in that silence, a truth had been written that no one on that base would ever forget.